CEO publicly mocks janitor's daughter. She fixes $5 million engine in minutes. Everyone in the room expected her to flinch. She didn't. Not when the CEO called her out. Not when the engineers laughed. Not even when the cameras turned to catch her fall. If the janitor's daughter can fix it, Victor de la Roche smirked, I'll fund her education myself. That moment, sharp, humiliating, and carefully orchestrated to entertain a room full of men in suits, should have broken her. But Lyra didn't break. She stepped forward. The air shifted. The laughter faded. And when the engine roared to life under her touch, it was the sound of silence that shattered the room. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where the smallest voice can shake empires. If stories of truth, justice, and quiet power move you, subscribe now and be part of this journey. Because sometimes the spark you need is just one story away. Lyra stood just outside the glass doors of Lux Technic's main auditorium, the lanyard around her neck still slightly twisted, the visitor badge half hidden behind the strap of her worn canvas backpack. Inside, the company's elite were already gathered, drinks in hand, murmurs bouncing off polished floors. Her father was somewhere in there, probably near the maintenance access hall, mop in hand, doing what he'd done for 20 years without ever being noticed. She hadn't meant to be here. She only came to drop off his lunch and a replacement battery pack he forgot at home. But when she stepped inside, she instantly knew she didn't belong. The glances were sharp, not cruel, but clearly questioning. One of the security guards narrowed his eyes at her, like she might steal a napkin. And then Victor de la Roche saw her. That was the moment everything changed. Victor, tall, graying, the kind of man whose name alone could freeze a boardroom, was already annoyed. His engineers had failed to restart the company's most advanced electric engine prototype for the third time that week. Millions of euros in R&D, countless hours, and no one could explain why it refused to start. The machine sat lifeless on a custom-built frame in the center of the room, drawing as much attention as a corpse at a wedding. Someone had suggested a software fault. Someone else blamed the custom casing. No one had answers. But Victor needed someone to blame, and his eyes landed on the quiet figure near the exit. That's Alain's daughter, isn't it? He said, loud enough to silence nearby chatter. I hear she likes engines. The room chuckled, awkward but obedient. Well then, he continued, turning fully to her. How about a challenge? Fix this, and I'll pay for whatever university she wants. A few people gasped. Others laughed outright. Lyra's face flushed, but she didn't step back. She looked at her father in the corner, frozen, eyes wide, mouth parted as if to warn her. She tightened her grip on the backpack strap. May I touch it? She asked, her voice soft but clear. Victor smiled like he'd already won. By all means, impress us. She didn't move quickly. She didn't perform. She walked to the engine like someone approaching a familiar tune. Set the bag down, unzipped it, pulled out a notebook patched with electrical tape. The pages inside were covered in handwritten equations, sketches, observations. She flipped to one that matched the engine layout. Someone near the front squinted at the drawing and muttered, Wait, that's nearly identical to the 112, a schematic. Another whispered, Isn't that proprietary? Lyra crouched beside the engine, fingers steady now. She unscrewed the top panel with a multi-tool from her bag, examined the core wiring without hesitation. The tension in the room thickened. Engineers leaned in. Phones recorded. She reached into the pack again and removed a single capacitor, a custom-fit low-resistance piece with a mark on it, CRW1. No one in the room recognized it. She slotted it in, adjusted a contact wire, and stepped back. Try it now, she said. Victor gestured. The lead engineer pressed the ignition key. The engine didn't stutter. It didn't hesitate. It roared. Clean. Perfect. The sound filled the chamber like thunder inside a chapel. Every voice caught mid-word. Every glass held mid-air. Victor's face lost its color. The cameras, still rolling, caught everything. From the moment he mocked her to the second the machine obeyed her like it was built for her hand alone. Lyra didn't say anything. She didn't gloat. She wiped her fingers on the sleeve of her hoodie and stepped back, eyes blank, breath shallow. Not because of nerves, but because this wasn't about winning a bet. This was something else, something buried. The truth, once dormant, had just started to breathe. Her father's eyes weren't just wide with shock. They were pleading, afraid, and unbearably familiar. That look, Lyra had only seen it once before, years ago, in a hospital hallway under fluorescent lights that never seemed to blink. She remembered that night, not because of what anyone said, but because of what was never said. The phone call, the trembling hands, the way he wrapped her violin in an old towel and held her too tightly as they sat on a bench for hours, waiting for news they already knew. There was a lab explosion, they said. No survivors, they said. Her mother's name, Camille Roche, had been wiped from every screen in that building by morning. Not even a funeral, not even a file, just a sealed report and a warning that no one wanted to explain. Now, standing in that room, the engine humming behind her and the weight of 50 stairs pressing in from all sides, Lyra felt it. The silence of that night had returned, not in grief, but in recognition. Something long buried had surfaced, and she knew it began with a notebook. Her fingers brushed over the worn cover like it might crumble from age. It wasn't hers. It was Camille's, a gift passed down in fragments. A few pages her father had hidden away in a locked drawer. A few more she found tucked in the lining of an old instrument case. Piece by piece, she'd reconstructed it. And as she did, she realized she wasn't just learning from her mother. She was remembering her. The diagrams weren't student notes. They were drafts, prototypes, ideas too advanced for the years written in their margins. Lyra recognized symbols even the Lux Technic white papers didn't use until recently. Fluid flow algorithms her professors couldn't explain. Sketches of modular turbines that looked suspiciously like the company's new microfusion project. She wasn't sure when the theft began, but she knew it wasn't accidental. Camille had been ahead of her time, and someone inside that building had known it. They'd taken her work, her ideas, her name, and they'd silenced it all. But Camille hadn't left quietly. She'd left breadcrumbs, technical notations with unique variables, markings like initials encrypted into schematics. Lyra had spent years trying to decode them, not even knowing what she was looking for. And now, as she replayed every lecture, every article, every memory her father tried to suppress, it all snapped into place. She remembered the time Camille showed her how pressure systems worked using a coffee maker. Not because of the lesson, but because she'd drawn it later and realized it matched the auxiliary bypass vent on the 112A engine. The same vent she'd adjusted 30 minutes ago. This wasn't intuition. It was inheritance. Not the kind written into wills, but the kind you absorb without knowing. Camille had known what they would do. She had prepared her daughter not just to survive, but to return. Lyra hadn't seen it coming until now, and the shame of not realizing sooner burned. Her mother had died, trying to protect something they were never supposed to understand, something far bigger than a job or a patent. Victor de la Roche didn't recognize her name, but he would. Not because Lyra wanted revenge, not because she wanted his company to fall, but because truth was oxygen, and lies, no matter how polished, always suffocate in the end. As she flipped through the pages in that moment, the engine still purring behind her like a forgotten anthem, she knew what came next wasn't optional. It was inevitable. Someone in that room had buried her mother. Someone had rewritten history. But the proof was in her hands, in her blood, and the sound of power restored by fingers they had underestimated. She looked up again, not at her father, not at the CEO, but at the crowd. Someone in there knew more. Someone in there remembered Camille Roche. Not the sanitized file version, but the real woman. The engineer who laughed while soldering, who hummed while drafting, who believed technology wasn't about power, but about people. Lyra's hands clenched the notebook a little tighter. They hadn't buried her mother. They'd only paused the story. And now it was hers to finish. Victor de la Roche's voice cut through the room like steel. Who are you? But the power in the question had already dissolved. It wasn't control. It was fear. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. The engine behind her spoke louder than any degree or resume could. And the silence around her said the rest. She looked to her father, then back to the crowd. I'm just someone who doesn't want to see a name erased again. She pulled the notebook close to her chest, then turned it to the page where her mother's original schematic lay side by side with the corrected model she'd built from memory. "This design," she said, her voice steady, "is not yours. It was never yours." A few engineers shifted uncomfortably. Donna, head of advanced development, stepped forward. "That's a very serious claim," she said, measured but curious. "You're accusing a multinational firm of intellectual theft. You understand that, right?" Lyra nodded. "Ido. And I have proof." She flipped to another page, this one dated 5 years earlier than the patent filing LuxTechnik had submitted. Camille's handwriting was still visible beneath Lyra's annotations. Ink faded but unmistakable. "These are my mother's designs, and you're still building off them today." She reached in her bag again and pulled out a folder. "This isn't just one engine. It's a timeline. Your core logic for the predictive power loop? She developed that algorithm when I was 7. Your micro-hybrid control schema? It matches her notes, variable for variable." The room held its breath as Donna took the folder and scanned the pages. Her eyes flicked back and forth, pausing on the margin notes, the sketches, the signatures. Then, softly, Camille Roche, a ripple of recognition passed through the room. A younger engineer near the back whispered, "She taught one of my intro classes at university." Someone else added, "I remember her name from an old training video." "But I thought you were told she died in a lab accident," Lyra interrupted. "And then she vanished from every record, because she tried to stop this." She turned to Victor. "You buried her work, but she left it with me." Victor's jaw tensed. "This is hearsay," he snapped. "Out-of-date sketches and an angry girl's conspiracy theory. No one's going to believe this." "They already do," Lyra said calmly. Then she reached for her phone, unlocked it, and cast the screen to the main projector. The video played, the one taken earlier that day, from the moment Victor mocked her to the moment the engine came to life. Every smirk, every dismissive comment, every second of stunned silence that followed. It ended on the frame where he asked, "Who are you?" And she replied, "Someone who loves engines." The room was silent, but the chat overlay on the projected screen wasn't. Comments flooded in. Shares skyrocketed. View count already passed 800,000. Victor turned pale. "Take that down," he ordered. "Now." No one moved. Donna looked at the comments, then at Lyra, and asked, "Why now? Why today?" Lyra didn't blink. "I wasn't planning to. I didn't come here for this. But when you made me a joke, you gave me the microphone. And I'm not handing it back." Behind her, her father stepped forward, slowly, voice shaking. "Her mother didn't just design that engine. She built it. She was the mind behind half of what you claim as breakthrough innovation. And when she realized someone inside the company was siphoning her research, she filed a complaint. The next week, she was gone." Lyra added, "You thought you buried her. You thought time would silence everything. But here we are." Donna stared down at the pages again. This matches our early-stage prototypes, even down to the anomalies we couldn't fix." Another engineer stepped forward, gray streaks in his beard. "I remember her," he said quietly. "She worked 2 doors down. I was there the night of the accident. I saw the explosion logs. But there was no recovery detail. No inquiry. Just an internal memo and a sealed file." "Because it wasn't an accident," Lyra said. "It was a cover-up." Victor laughed, sharp, desperate. "You think this viral stunt changes anything? You think the public will care?" "They already do," Donna said, her voice now steady. "We've been lying. Whether by choice or by silence, we've all been part of it." One by one, people in the room began to react. Phones lit up. Messages flew between employees. Files were being pulled. Screenshots compared. A young developer opened his laptop and whispered, "She's right. The variable sequence in the V7 model matches the one in her mother's notes, years before the company filed patents." "That's impossible," Victor muttered. "It's not," Lyra replied. "You just hope no one would notice." In the corner, a marketing assistant uploaded the entire timeline to a private archive. Another employee began compiling logs from past projects for internal review. Someone in HR hesitantly opened a file labeled Roche_case_confidential. Meanwhile, The video kept climbing, now past 1.2 million. News outlets were picking it up. Hashtags were trending. Camille Roche wasn't just a ghost anymore. She was front page. Victor's hands trembled. None of this proves ownership. You don't have patents. You don't have legal standing. Maybe not, Lyra said, but we have evidence. And now the world is watching. Donna turned to her. What do you want us to do? Lyra looked at them all, engineers, assistants, managers, and said, speak. If you remember her, if you used her work, if you ever heard her name and wondered why it vanished, say something. Not for me, for her. Slowly, the room began to move. One engineer said, I used her turbine ratios in my thesis. No one ever cited her. Another added, her training modules were deleted from the portal right after the accident. I thought it was a glitch. Leonard, the senior engineer, spoke last. I saw her submit the early-stage schematics to R&D. I saw them rerouted. I didn't stop it. Victor tried again, raising his voice. This doesn't change anything. But the room no longer listened. Authority had shifted. The truth had spread. And Camille's voice, carried by her daughter, was finally being heard. Victor de la Roche wasn't used to being challenged. He was used to being feared. He paced behind the glass conference wall like a man searching for a lever that no longer existed, firing off orders to assistants, trying to rally control with half-truths and confident lies. Get legal on the line. Tell PR to draft a neutral statement. Lock down internal files. Anyone caught leaking data is fired immediately. But it wasn't working. Not this time. There were too many cracks now, and truth was seeping through like water under pressure. Outside that glass, the room he used to dominate had changed. It didn't belong to him anymore. The engineers weren't moving. Not with urgency. Not with loyalty. Many stood still, eyes locked on Lyra, the hum of the engine still in their ears like a distant bell. Some looked conflicted, confused by their own silence. Some looked guilty, and some looked ready. Donna was the first to speak, loud enough for the whole room to hear. We've been working under the assumption that our breakthroughs were our own. But I've looked at her documents. They match ours in structure, in sequencing, in function. The names were changed. The files were scrubbed. But this wasn't a coincidence. It was a theft. Her words carried weight, not because of volume, but because of who she was. Everyone in the room respected Donna. And now, she stood with Lyra. Victor slammed his hand on the table. So what, Donna? You want to burn the company down because a teenager came in with a notebook? No, she said. I want to stop pretending we don't know what we've done. Victor turned to the room. Anyone who speaks up now destroys their own career. You think other companies will hire you? You'll be branded whistleblowers. Traitors. He thought fear would be enough. It always had been. But Lyra stepped forward and said what no one else had dared to. Your silence didn't protect you. It only protected him. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. Her words were precise, measured. Her eyes scanned the room. Some of you knew. Some of you suspected. Some of you never questioned it. I don't care which. What matters is what you do now. If you believe Camille, Roche deserves to be remembered. If you believe the truth should matter more than protecting a nameplate on your door, then prove it. There was a long pause. Then a voice from the back. I joined Lux Technic because I believed in what we were building, a young systems engineer said. But if we're building it on stolen work, then we're not engineers. We're thieves. She pulled her badge from her collar and placed it on the nearest desk. A moment later, another followed, and then another. Leonard looked down at his own ID, hands shaking. I knew. Not everything, but enough. I told myself I couldn't prove it, so I did nothing. I was afraid of being shut out. Afraid of being erased like she was. But I watched her brilliance disappear. I watched them rewrite history, and I said nothing. He set his badge beside the others. I won't be quiet anymore. Victor's voice turned sharp. You're all fools. This company made your lives, your careers, and you'd throw that away for what? For a dead woman's revenge story? It's not about revenge, Lyra said. It's about correction. Donna walked up beside her. You lied to us. You weaponized our loyalty. You told us we were breaking ground, when all we were doing was building on the grave of a better mind. More employees moved now. Quietly. Deliberately. People who had spent years in the system, suddenly aware of what they'd enabled. A data analyst dropped his laptop bag on the table. A software lead logged out of her console and closed the terminal without saving. One by one, badges hit the floor like dominoes. A rhythm. A reckoning. It wasn't loud. It was deliberate, like peeling away layers of a lie that had been worn too long. Victor tried to rally the few still watching from the side. Don't let emotion dictate your future. You think this girl is going to run a company? She doesn't even have a degree. Lyra turned toward him, her voice clear. I don't want to run your company. I want to dismantle the lie it was built on. In the silence that followed, a man in a tailored suit, legal counsel, quietly stepped forward and whispered something to Victor. His face stiffened. Whatever defense he had left was crumbling. His empire, built on control, was unraveling in the space of a conversation. And he could feel it. Lyra faced the room again. You've all seen what happened when one person speaks. Imagine what happens when 10 do. Or 50. This doesn't have to end in lawsuits and silence. It can end in justice. But not if you keep pretending this didn't happen. One of the last undecided engineers, a woman who had worked in R&D since before Lyra was born, walked slowly to the table and removed her badge. Camille trained me, she said. She stayed late to help me learn signal balancing when no one else would. They told me she was gone, but they didn't tell me she was erased. She looked at Lyra. I see her in you, and I won't let her vanish again. The final line of resistance broke. Victor stood alone, surrounded by silence, no longer respected, no longer feared. Just a man in a suit clinging to power that no one wanted to acknowledge anymore. The people had chosen, not revenge, not rebellion, but truth. And truth had won. It didn't take long. The video had crossed 15 million views by the end of the second day. Public pressure, mounted like a tide, no corporate firewall could hold. Journalists pulled records. Former employees came forward. Anonymous tips flooded inboxes. Internal documents leaked. Memos, project timelines, withheld patents. Within 72 hours, the Ministry of Technological Ethics launched a formal investigation into Lux Technic, and subpoenas followed. Victor de la Roche went quiet. His legal team tried to negotiate a public statement, but the damage was already done. Camille Roche's name was everywhere, in headlines, in hashtags, in handwritten signs outside Lux Technic's headquarters. People demanded to know why one of the most brilliant engineers of her generation had been buried without a trace. Lyra didn't give interviews. She didn't need to. The footage spoke for her. So did the files. So did the voices of engineers who once whispered in hallways, but now spoke in full paragraphs on record. Camille's work had powered some of the most celebrated innovations Lux Technic had ever produced, and now the world knew it wasn't theirs. It had never been. In a televised address, the Minister of Science and Culture stood before a podium and declared, Camille Roche was not forgotten. She was erased. Today, we begin to correct that failure. Lyra stood beside her father in the front row of the ceremony as they unveiled the posthumous honor, National Distinguished Engineer. It came with a citation, a permanent display at the National Hall of Innovation, and an official declaration from the Prime Minister's office acknowledging Camille Roche's pioneering contributions to sustainable energy technology and the moral cost of corporate secrecy. As the medal was placed into a clear case on stage, Lyra didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her mother's name was no longer a ghost. It was a beacon. But the recognition wasn't the end. It was the beginning. A week later, Lyra was summoned to a quiet office in the Department of Scientific Equity. The room was minimalist. No grandeur, no distractions. Just a single folder across the table. The man who handed it to her introduced himself simply, Calvin Rohr, acting chair of the Federal Committee on Ethical Innovation. He spoke clearly, calmly. This, he said, is not a job offer. It's an opportunity to build something that should have existed long ago. Inside the folder was the framework for a new initiative, the Roche Project, a federally funded program designed to identify, mentor, and protect young inventors from underrepresented backgrounds. It would offer access to labs, legal resources, patent education, mental health support, and above all, visibility. It wasn't about correcting the past. It was about securing the future. And at the top of the leadership chart, printed in bold, was her name, Lyra Roche de la Roche, Program Director. She stared at it for a long moment before speaking. I didn't think they'd ever give her a voice again. Calvin replied, They didn't. You did. Lyra signed the acceptance letter that night. Within a month, the Roche project launched publicly with over 200 applicants in the first week. The media spun it as a feel-good story, but inside the labs, inside the workrooms, it was something else. It was transformation. Kids from schools no one recruited from were designing engine parts. Young women who'd never touched a soldering iron were assembling circuit boards with mentors who finally looked like them. For every name that had been forgotten, erased, or pushed aside, there was now a space where they belonged. At the inaugural conference, Lyra took the stage not as the daughter of a janitor, not as a teenage girl who embarrassed a CEO, but as the architect of a future her mother had once imagined. She didn't speak about revenge. She spoke about structure, about how systems fail when they're built only for the powerful, and about how innovation cannot thrive in silence. The crowd stood in full applause, not because she had won, but because she had turned what should have broken her into something no one could deny. Justice hadn't arrived with handcuffs. It had arrived with clarity, with visibility, with names restored, and futures rebuilt. Camille Roche had been silenced. Lyra had changed that. And now, nothing would be buried again. They told her it would be a small event, just a closing ceremony for the first wave of Roche Project Fellows. But Lyra knew the moment she stepped into the room that it was something more. There was no press, no stage lights, no polished speeches. Just rows of students, engineers, mentors, and workers, some still wearing lab coats, others in worn hoodies, all gathered in quiet anticipation. In the front row sat her father, hands folded, eyes steady. And beside him, on an empty chair with a single rose and a folded blueprint, rested her mother's old violin. She hadn't touched it in years. It still carried the notches Camille had etched into the side for finger positioning, along with a scrawled formula she'd once joked was the math of melody. Lyra didn't bring the violin to prove anything. She brought it because it was time, not to speak about Camille, but to speak with her in the only language that still felt private, unfiltered, and real. When she stepped forward, she didn't introduce herself. She didn't reference the scandal or the company or the viral moment that changed everything. She simply said, "My mother believed that sound and structure came from the same place." She said engines and music weren't so different, that they both ran on pressure, timing, and resonance. She looked at the room, then at the instrument. This piece was the last thing she wrote before everything changed. I only found it after she was gone. She never recorded it. But I think she meant it to be heard by people who would understand what it was really about. She didn't explain the title. She didn't need to. It was written in the top corner of the sheet, Blueprint in E. A dual composition, one for string, one for circuit. The first note rang out tentative, unsure, but then it settled, grew, layered. The melody was delicate but methodical, a slow build of minor tones interlaced with an almost mechanical rhythm. Each phrase mimicked movement, like a valve opening, a turbine spinning, a pulse of heat through wire. It wasn't background music. It was a conversation between function and feeling, between grief and persistence. Halfway through, the tone shifted. A sudden modulation, not jarring but undeniable. A passage where the bow struck harder, as if pushing against resistance. Lyra's fingers stumbled for half a second, not because she forgot, but because the notes didn't feel like hers. They were Camille's. Written during the same months, she was designing the original engine layout that would later be stolen. The phrasing matched her sketches, rising and falling in the same pattern as the prototype's fuel curve. Every crescendo mirrored a system surge. Every rest matched the intake cycle. Camille hadn't just composed music. She'd encoded memory. By the final bars, the room was still. Not frozen, just held. No one breathed louder than the strings. When Lyra reached the last note, she didn't let it fade. She sustained it just long enough to feel the vibration return through the wood, through her hand, into her chest. When silence returned, no one clapped. They simply sat with it, letting the sound settle in their bones. What Lyra had given them wasn't performance, it was translation. She had turned innovation into melody, proof into emotion, justice into harmony. Her voice, when it came back, was quiet. My mother built machines to give people energy, but she wrote this to give them memory. She looked toward the banner at the back of the room. Not a corporate logo, not a seal, but a line from Camille's notes. Nothing beautiful survives without being heard. Lyra set the violin back in its case. She didn't close the lid. She didn't have to. The sound was already living in the room. The plaque was simple. No motivate, no gold leaf. Just brushed steel, etched with a name that had once been erased. Camille Roche Institute for Ethical Engineering. Lyra stepped onto the platform as the crowd gathered beneath the early morning light, her footsteps firm, her purpose unshaken. Government officials were present, yes. So were scientists, journalists, and students. But the moment didn't belong to them. It belonged to her, to Camille, to every voice that had ever been buried under someone else's ambition. This wasn't just a ribbon cutting. It was reclamation. She didn't speak from a teleprompter. She carried no script. She didn't need one. She had lived the message. My mother never wanted fame, she said. She didn't build engines for applause. She built them because she believed in progress, in purpose, in people. But what was stolen from her wasn't just her work, it was her presence, her future, her voice. Today we give that back. And not just to her. To every mind that's been overlooked, every idea dismissed, every truth buried under polished lies. This institute is not a monument to what was lost. It's a launch pad for what's next. She paused, letting the silence settle not as absence, but as resonance. If one woman could design a future while the world ignored her, then her daughter will make sure no one ignores it again. Behind her, the doors to the institute opened. Not to a museum, but to a working lab, already active, already alive with research led by young engineers from every background, some who had never even imagined themselves in a place like this. But now, they didn't have to imagine. They just had to walk through the doors. As the crowd stood in quiet recognition, Lyra glanced to the side where her father stood, hands folded the same way they had been when he used to wait outside Camille's lab late at night, back when none of them knew how short that time would be. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. This was her mother's voice, finally unmuted. And as the cameras clicked and the live stream rolled, Lyra ended with a message not just for those in the room, but for everyone who had followed her story from the first spark to this moment of ignition. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing that truth still matters, and that memory is worth protecting. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that silence can be broken and justice can rise, don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it, and subscribe to Cracks of Light, because we are just getting started, and the world still has a lot of listening to do.